Carney never disclosed his conflict of interest before the election. He used a loophole to ensure that Canadians didn't know that. They didn't have the opportunity to vote on it. If we would have understood the depth and how deep the tentacles run in terms of all the investments and how little they actually end up overlapping with Canadian interest, maybe we would have had a different result.
We recognize very much the critical role that flight attendants play in keeping Canadians and their families safe as they travel, comfortable as they travel. And it's important that they're compensated equitably at all times, fairly at all times.
Riddle me this. What happens when political elites, corporate giants, and backroom deals collide? Well, the answer is democracy ends up under siege, and Canada is no exception. Today, we're exposing a story that should be front page news all across the country. Independent journalist Greg Staley of Diverge Media has uncovered explosive details surrounding the recent Air Canada strike, a labor dispute that the federal government appeared ready to crush before it even began. It involves none other than Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney, Air Canada, and Carney's supposed blind trust portfolio that houses investments in Brookfield Asset Management. He's alleged to have made a backdoor deal with Air Canada's CEO, Michael Rousseau, further hinting at a massive conflict of interest, because as workers prepared to hit the picket lines, Ottawa was said to be making deals behind the scenes. And it all boils down to Canada's tightly controlled airline industry and Mark Carney protecting his own political and financial interests, not the public's. With Carney at the helm, the lines between public service and private profit have never been blurrier. This isn't just a story about a strike, it's a window into how power really works in Canada. Here's what Greg uncovered.
So, I mean, it wasn't hard to find. It's out there. And somebody kind of made the joke to me. It's like a better question with Carney would be, what doesn't he have a conflict of interest in? But in this case, Brookfield, obviously we know Carney's heavily invested there, has investments in a company called Chorus Aviation. They hold 13.2% stake in that company. Air Canada also has a stake in Chorus Aviation of about 10%. So Brookfield invested $374 million into this company. And under Chorus Aviation is a company called Jazz. It's a subsidiary of theirs that operates over 50 aircraft in the Air Canada fleet. So you can go right on Air Canada's website and you can see their different airplanes and it'll say who operates them. And that's where those numbers come from. But, you know, putting it simply, there's a major question about the motivation of Carney and how quick and swiftly he acted. Less than 12 hours of a strike, and he comes down hard. And then you find, hey, Brookfield's got hundreds of millions of dollars wrapped up in this company that has all these airplanes flying under the Air Canada banner. It looks really, really bad. And additionally, I pointed out in that article that a senior advisor in the aviation sector for their investment for Brookfield specifically is a former Air Canada CEO. So you have not only the layer of financial interest, but you have also friends and advisors potentially in his ear. And the real people that, you know, take the hit on this is the Canadian people, is Canadian citizens, because we can't trust that the Prime Minister is acting in the best interest of Canadians. Then what do we have right now?
Well, many Canadians would say that we don't have much left, given that Carney, handpicked by Liberal faithful, dodged conflict of interest rules for months. Only after calling a snap election did he admit to 16 plus pages of ethics violations, mostly tied to U.S. investments. The solution was a supposed blind trust, as if he suddenly forgot where his millions lie. I would say it's a farce, and Canadians deserve better.
Yeah, you don't lose an understanding of where your investments are or what sectors they are because suddenly you put them in a, quote, blind trust, right? And with Canada, we have a huge monopoly problem, but it benefits investors hugely because if there's only a handful of winners in a market, it's pretty easy to choose which one's going to be good. And then you can legislate and regulate, you know, special privileges for those monopolies and those companies a lot easier as well. So in Carney's case, I mean, it was, I think Wyatt Claypool of the National Telegraph pointed out, like Canada, you know, a good approach would have been, hey, we need to reduce airline burden, regulatory burdens, tax burdens, make them more competitive, and they can redistribute that maybe to their employees. Instead, what we have is the government coming down with a foot Air Canada is going to have to pay out a bunch more money in a very tight market. Like there's not a lot of extra money in that. The airline, I think their net's under 9%. So that just got a little bit tighter, and they still have to be competitive with other airlines. But all that to say, monopolies definitely benefit people like Carney because it just makes investing that much easier. But one more point on that. I know everybody thinks this guy is the green agenda, ESG guy, and he is that, but he's playing both sides and talking out of both sides of his mouth. He's also invested in oil and gas pipelines. He's also invested in coal, like through Brookfield. And I pointed out before the election that he's the perfect candidate for foreign interference because they have billions of dollars in political sensitive investments in China. And at the same time, they have billions of dollars invested in American LNG plants that export to China. So what does that put, where does that put Canada? Because now the man that's supposed to protect Canadians, his interests are divided and not for Canadians.
Now let's pause for a second here because Carney brands himself as Canada's champion of ESG. That stands for environmental, social, and governance principles. But as Stally points out, he's still heavily invested in oil, gas, coal, and energy infrastructure tied to China and the United States. So it's highly relevant to question who he's really serving. Carney claims transparency, accountability, and sustainable leadership, but it seems he's actually more into greenwashed profiteering with strategic financial positioning dressed up as climate concern.
But should we be flying less now?
We should be taking into account the impact of our flying on the planet now. And that's
pushing up the tax on flying.
You push up the tax on flying, you push up the cost on transport, and that's in part what putting a price on carbon is.
He's leveraging the language of sustainability to consolidate global influence, not deliver to Canadians. And when it comes to Air Canada, there was no real plan.
As Minister of Labour, I have exercised my authorities under Section 107 of the Canadian Labour Code to direct the Canada Industrial Relations Board to order the parties to resume and continue their operations and duties in order to secure industrial peace and protect the interests of Canada, Canadians, and the economy.
Just the Carney Liberals stepping in to invoke Section 107 of the Canada Labour Code and force flight attendants back to work.
As the strike happened.
But you didn't make any provisions before to ensure that passengers, or at least some of them, would get to where they're going?
Well, we thought, obviously, the Section 107 would be enforced and that they wouldn't illegally avoid the Section 107.
Right. So you made no provision because you didn't realize the union would do this.
They gave us no indication they would do this.
Right.
I don't even know what to say on that. I mean, it's pretty gross. And at the end of the day, it's not even surprising to me anymore. I don't think it's surprising to most Canadians. But the fact that a big corporate entity like this would say, hey, we're relying on the government to squash this so that we don't have to negotiate in good faith is beyond disgusting. I don't care what party it is involved. It's gross. And I think Canadians see it for what it is. This is an absolute PR nightmare for Carney and the Liberals. They are the traditional union party, and they just gave that up. And now the NDP gets to come in and say, hey, we're not them. And what a great opportunity for them, right?
So while the NDP is trying to stay relevant by attempting to advocate against what they call Carney's attack on Air Canada's flight attendants, this whole strike fiasco seemed more like a political power play, while the Canadian government stepping in on behalf of corporate elites. And the real losers are the flight attendants and ultimately you, the Canadian taxpayer and citizen, especially those who were stranded or missed out on travel plans because of this mess. The CEO and Carney thought that the airline workers would fold, but they stood firm.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword. I think we're in an environment, it's hard to live right now. Things are getting out of hand expensive. So yeah, you're going to see the unions get more aggressive in fighting for what they feel is a fair deal for their members, right? And at the same time, you don't want to see costs run away because of 15 or 20% increase over 4 years. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. But the way that's kind of really resolved is you need a strong economy. And it's been decimated under the Liberals for the last 10 years. And the guy that's supposed to come in and fix it, we lost 40,000 jobs last month. But elbows up, I guess.
And so this cycle continues, rising costs, stagnant wages, and a government that serves only a few, While workers are tightening their belts, executives and political insiders are padding their portfolios. It sounds familiar, and so Stally has a message.
It's Canadians' duty to speak up. If we know something's wrong and we don't speak up, we are doing wrong at that point. So my view as a journalist is, listen, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle things are happening on. If we see wrong, we need to call it out because that is our duty. So it's easy for this to get swept up in the news cycle, and it's easy for us to blame other people. But if you're watching this right now, you can like this, you can share this, you can subscribe to people like Rebel News and put this information out, and you're doing your job. You don't need to be the person on the ground exposing it. You don't need to be a Tamara Ugolini that's doing the legwork. But by sharing it, you are helping to amplify and expose what's going on, and that is a very valuable thing for Canada.
Stally's right. You don't need to be on the ground with a microphone, but when you share, talk, or question, you help to push back against the tide of collusion that's drowning our country.
In relation to this topic, no, I think I would love to see the NDP and Conservatives pick up the fact that there is this conflict of interest here. This is something that shouldn't go by the wayside. Obviously, we knew, again, I'm personally upset with this because Carney never disclosed his conflict of interest before the election. He used a loophole to ensure that Canadians didn't know that. They didn't have the opportunity to vote on it. If we would have understood the depth and how deep the tentacles run in terms of all the investments and how little they actually end up overlapping with Canadian interest, maybe we would have had a different result. But unfortunately, now we're stuck with it. And all we can do is say, every time there's something that there's a potential conflict there, we call it out. And at the end of the day, I think this Prime Minister's time, he's on borrowed time. I don't think he's doing great. There's nothing he can hang his hat on in terms of policy, and he's in a minority government.
So all this to say, what's the takeaway here? Carney, he holds financial stakes in Air Canada-linked companies, and his government used their power to try and quash the strike that threatened these same interests, which would have forced workers back within hours. It's a clear case of not only poor governance, but systemic betrayal. With Air Canada and WestJet dominating Canadian skies, why are Canadians tolerating what basically amounts to an economic cartel? The result is predictable: higher prices, fewer choices, no real competition, and subpar service that's often unreliable. Canada is the second largest country in the world by landmass, yet there is virtually no meaningful competition in our domestic air travel market. Smaller carriers never stood a chance. They were crushed by liberal policies, from lockdowns in 2020 to the carbon tax. Many simply just couldn't survive. And Air Canada's strike may be resolved for now, but it's been days of chaos, and they're left scrambling to pick up the pieces. For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. A fun way that you can support our work at home is by visiting the Rebel News store. Head on over to rebelnewsstore.com, pick out your favorite swag to sport out in the wild, and use code TAMARA10 to save 10% off at checkout. That's TAMARA number 10 at checkout. All of that and more at rebelnewsstore.com.